In the long history of humankind's attempt to understand the mind, certain figures rise above the rest, not merely because they proposed new theories, but because they changed the very way we think about ourselves. Among these rare visionaries stands Carl Gustav Jung, Swiss psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, cultural explorer, and founder of analytical psychology, a man whose work continues to ripple across psychology, art, literature, religion, and philosophy more than 60 years after his death. Born in 1875 the tranquil Swiss village of Keswil, Jung would grow from a solitary, introspective boy into a pioneer who ventured fearlessly into the uncharted depths of the human psyche. While trained in medicine and grounded in the scientific method, he possessed an unquenchable curiosity that drew him beyond the boundaries of conventional psychiatry. His quest was not simply to treat mental illness, but to understand the whole human being, mind, body, and spirit in all its complexity. For Jung, psychology was not merely a clinical science, it was a map of the soul. He saw the psyche not as a random collection of urges and memories, but as a structured, living system animated by both personal experiences and universal patterns. This radical vision gave birth to concepts that are now part of the modern vocabulary: the introvert and extrovert, the archetype, the shadow, the anima and animus, the collective unconscious, and the process of individuation. These terms have become so woven into popular and professional discourse that it is easy to forget they originated with one man's sustained engagement with the mysteries of the mind. Yet, Jung's influence extends far beyond terminology. His approach was revolutionary because it integrated science with symbolism, clinical observation with myth, and individual therapy with cultural critique. He could speak fluently in the language of psychiatry, referencing experimental studies and neurological findings, and in the same breath draw connections to ancient myths, alchemical texts, and Eastern philosophies. This ability to bridge worlds made him both admired and controversial in his own time, and it is part of why his legacy has endured. The story of Jung's life is one of intellectual courage and personal confrontation. Early in his career, he became the protege and close collaborator of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. Together, they sought to advance the understanding of the unconscious mind. But Jung's growing conviction that the psyche contained more than repressed sexual desires, that it held a collective, symbolic dimension shared across humanity, led to a dramatic and permanent break between the two men. In the wake of this split, Jung embarked on an extraordinary inner journey, documented in his now famous Red Book, during which he engaged directly with the figures and symbols of his own unconscious. From these experiences emerged a fully formed system of thought, analytical psychology, that sought to explain not only the roots of psychological distress, but also the path toward integration and meaning. Central to this system was the idea of individuation, the lifelong process by which a person becomes whole by reconciling conscious and unconscious parts of the self. For Jung, individuation was not optional. It was the fundamental task of human life. But Jung's vision was not confined to the consulting room. He traveled widely to North Africa, to the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, to India, seeking to understand how the archetypes of the collective unconscious express themselves in different cultures. His conversations with tribal elders, his study of Eastern spiritual traditions, and his observations of ritual and art convinced him that psychological patterns are universal, though their symbols and expressions vary. These cross-cultural encounters deepened his conviction that modern Western society, in its embrace of materialism and rationalism, had lost touch with its symbolic life, and that this loss was at the root of much individual and collective malaise. In his personal life, Jung was as complex as his theories suggest. He was a devoted husband to Emma Rauschenbach, Jung herself a gifted analyst and scholar, and a father to 5 children. At the same time, his intellectual and emotional partnerships with other women, particularly Toni Wolff, challenged conventional ideas about marriage and collaboration. Friends and patients described him as deeply empathetic, often humorous, yet uncompromising when pursuing a line of inquiry. He could be reserved and solitary for long stretches, then magnetic and animated when engaged in meaningful dialogue. The later decades of Jung's life were marked by consolidation and refinement. His writings, including Psychological Types, Symbols of Transformation, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, and Aeon, laid out the architecture of the psyche in meticulous detail. His lectures attracted students from around the world. In 1948, the founding of the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich ensured that his methods would continue to be taught and practiced long after his death. Carl Jung died in 1961, leaving behind not only a body of work, but a way of seeing. His legacy is not static. It is a living framework that continues to evolve in the hands of analysts, scholars, artists, and seekers. In an age when human beings are increasingly disconnected from themselves and from one another, Jung's insistence on listening to the inner voice, honoring symbols, and embracing the full range of human experience remains profoundly relevant. To call Jung the master of psychology is to recognize his mastery in mapping the inner world, charting its landscapes of shadow and light, its rivers of memory, its mountains of aspiration. To call him the father of Western analytical thought is to acknowledge that he founded an enduring school of psychology that treats human beings not as machines to be repaired, but as whole persons whose lives are journeys of discovery. This script will take you through every stage of his extraordinary life, his origins and education, his career and theoretical breakthroughs, his travels and cross-cultural insights, his personal relationships, his major works, and the enduring impact of his ideas. Along the way, we will see not only the intellectual achievements, but also the human being behind them, the man who dared to confront his own depths so that others might find the courage to explore theirs. By the end, you will understand why Carl Jung's name stands alongside the greatest minds in history, and why his work continues to offer a compass for those navigating the complex, symbolic, and ever-unfolding terrain of the human psyche. Opening hook: the timeless mind of Carl Jung. In the vast landscape of human thought, a few names rise above the centuries as timeless beacons guiding not only the intellectual currents of their own era, but also shaping the inner lives of generations far beyond. Carl Gustav Jung is one such name. Born in 1875 the quiet Swiss village of Keswil, he would grow to become a figure who bridged the deepest chasms between science and spirituality, reason and myth, the measurable and the mysterious. Jung was not simply a psychiatrist, he was an explorer of the soul-charting territories that most of his contemporaries dared not enter. To him, psychology was not merely a clinical tool for diagnosing illness, it was the master key to understanding human existence itself. And in that understanding lay a revolution, one that would forever transform Western thought. Today, his concepts, archetypes, the collective unconscious, introversion and extroversion, synchronicity, and individuation have entered not just academic circles, but also everyday language, literature, cinema, and even popular self-help culture. And yet, for many, Jung remains a mystery. Who was the man behind these ideas? What shaped his vision? And why, decades after his death in 1961, does he remain revered as the master of psychology? To call Jung the father of Western analytical psychology is no casual compliment. It is an acknowledgement that he created an entirely new framework for understanding the human psyche, one that did not reduce people to symptoms, but elevated them into myth-makers, seekers, and creators. Unlike many of his peers, Jung believed that the unconscious was not merely a chaotic storage room for repressed desires, as Freud often described it, but a vast, structured, and universal ocean of images, symbols, and patterns that connect all human beings across time and culture. By daring to explore this realm and by devising a language to describe it, Jung opened a new era of psychological thought. In doing so, he not only helped individuals heal, but also gave modern civilization a way to reconnect with the wisdom of ancient myths, religions, and art. This script will dive deep into every aspect of his life, his origins and early influences that seeded his fascination with the human mind, his academic and professional path, including his alliance and break with Freud, the birth of analytical psychology, and his groundbreaking theories, his personal life and marriage to Emma Rauschenbach, a relationship of both collaboration and complexity, his global influence on psychotherapy, art, literature, and popular culture, an intimate portrait of his personality, the contradictions, strengths, and vulnerabilities that made him human. In the end, we will arrive at the central answer why Carl Jung deserves his place as a master and a father of modern psychology. Carl Gustav Jung was born on the 26th of July, 1875, in Keswil, a small village in the Swiss canton of Thurgau, on the peaceful shores of Lake Constance. His father, Paul Achilles Jung, was a Protestant pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, while his mother, Emily Pricework, came from a family with a strong interest in spiritualism, mysticism, and the supernatural. These two parental influences, one rooted in structured theological tradition, the other in mystical intuition and the unseen world, would form the twin currents that ran through Jung's entire intellectual life. From his father, Jung absorbed the language of sermons, biblical imagery, and moral reasoning. From his mother, he inherited a fascination with dreams, visions, and the possibility that reality extended far beyond the material. Jung was an only child for the first 9 years of his life, and he spent much of that time in solitude. Unlike children who thrive in groups, Jung felt more at ease alone, often inventing elaborate worlds in his imagination. He built miniature towns, carved tiny figures, and created elaborate narratives in his mind acts that, though typical of childhood play, hinted at a future where symbolism and the inner world would be central to his work. He was also an unusually observant and introspective child. In his later autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung described how, even as a boy, he would withdraw from noisy social situations to reflect quietly, sometimes feeling that he carried two personalities, one that belonged to the modern world and another that seemed ancient, timeless, and connected to something greater. From an early age, Jung had vivid dreams and visions. One of his most famous early dreams involved a gigantic underground chamber with a golden throne and an enormous phallic figure imagery that would much later become part of his theoretical understanding of archetypes and the collective unconscious. His mother's own episodes of emotional withdrawal, combined with her interest in spiritual matters, created an environment where Jung could talk about such visions without fear of dismissal. In many ways, Emily Pricework became his first audience and perhaps his first patient in matters of the inner world. Jung's school life was not straightforward. As a boy, he often clashed with the rigid structure of formal education. He was intelligent but easily bored by rote learning. At one point, after an incident in which he was knocked unconscious, Jung began to experience fainting spells whenever he had to return to schoolwork, a psychosomatic reaction that revealed his deep aversion to certain forms of academic pressure. For almost a year, he avoided classes, enjoying the freedom of roaming outdoors and engaging in solitary pursuits. Eventually, realizing the long-term consequences of avoiding education, he forced himself to return, this time approaching his studies with more discipline. In his teenage years, Jung developed a passion for philosophy, particularly the works of Goethe, Kant, and Schopenhauer. He also found inspiration in literature and history, exploring how human thought evolved over centuries. But it was his growing fascination with the natural sciences, especially biology and geology, that would eventually lead him toward medicine. This intellectual curiosity was not limited to books. Jung would take long walks in the Swiss countryside, collecting stones and fossils, studying the structure of plants, and observing animals. To him, the natural world was a mirror of the human mind, a living system of patterns and relationships. In 1895, Jung enrolled at the University of Basel to study medicine. Initially, he considered specializing in archaeology, but practical concerns about career prospects led him toward psychiatry, a field that was then just beginning to emerge as a bridge between biology and psychology. At Basel, Jung was exposed to a wide range of disciplines: anatomy, physiology, pathology, and the burgeoning study of the human nervous system. He also attended lectures on philosophy and comparative religion, finding ways to connect science with the symbolic and spiritual dimensions of life. The turning point came when Jung read Textbook of Psychiatry by Richard von Krafft-Ebing and later encountered the works of Pierre Janet, a French psychologist who studied dissociation and subconscious processes. These readings convinced him that psychiatry was the perfect field for someone with his dual interest in empirical science and the mysteries of the mind. In 1900, after earning his medical degree, Jung secured a position at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, under the direction of Eugen Bleuler, a pioneer in the study of schizophrenia. This marked the beginning of a career that would reshape the very foundations of psychology. In 1900, fresh from medical training, Carl Jung arrived at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, then one of Europe's most progressive clinics, directed by Eugen Bleuler, the clinician who would soon coin the term schizophrenia. Burghölzli was not a warehouse for the mad, it was a research engine. Wards doubled as laboratories, observation was paired with measurement, case histories were not anecdotes but data. Jung thrived in this environment. He absorbed Bleuler's humane focus on the whole person and his insistence that careful phenomenology should precede theory. Day by day, Jung sat at bedsides, taking meticulous notes on speech patterns, gestures, slips of the tongue, dream fragments, and family histories. He learned that beneath the same diagnosis, patients carried distinct inner dramas. The question that began to burn in him was simple and radical. What inner constellations of meaning drive these symptoms? Jung's answer started with an elegant instrument and a simple task. Using a chronoscope to millisecond precision and a galvanometer to detect subtle changes in skin conductance, he presented patients with a standardized list of stimulus words: mother, money, death, house, love, secret, and so on, and recorded their reaction times, verbal responses, slips, laughter, perseverations, memory lapses, and autonomic changes. Healthy subjects typically responded quickly and neutrally, but many patients showed systematic delays or distortions clustered around certain themes. From these regularities, Jung inferred what he called feeling-toned complexes, emotionally charged constellations of ideas, memories, images, and expectations that organize attention and behavior outside conscious control. A complex is not a disorder in itself. It is a mini-personality with its own aims, often formed around unresolved conflict, family, sexuality, status, guilt, grief. Complexes catch the ego. They own us for a moment, bending perception and action. Jung and collaborator Franz Ricklin published the results in a series of papers later gathered as Diagnostische Associationsstudien, Diagnostic Association Studies, 1904-1907. Clinically, the test helped differentiate conditions, track treatment, and even detect deception. Theoretically, it established a cornerstone of Jung's psychology. The psyche is structurally patterned, and much of its patterning is unconscious but lawful. Key insight: symptoms are not random malfunctions. They are symbolic communications from a complex trying to complete its story. Jung's first book, The Psychology of Dementia Praecox, 1907, challenged the view that psychosis was mere deterioration. He argued that even in severe disturbance, there is intelligible symbolic content. Hallucinations, neologisms, and delusions often condense personal and mythic themes. The task of therapy, then, is not only to manage symptoms, but to translate their inner logic to hear the mind's metaphor. This thesis, scientific in method, heretical in implication, marked Jung as a rising original. It also put him squarely on the radar of a Viennese pioneer already mapping the unconscious. In 1906, Jung mailed Freud his association studies. The first meeting came in March 1000, 907-inch Vienna. Legend has it they spoke for 13 hours straight. Jung admired Freud's clinical audacity and his insistence that symptoms have psychological meaning. Freud, for his part, saw in Jung the non-Jewish, scientifically credentialed heir who could carry psychoanalysis into the mainstream of European medicine. The alliance deepened quickly. In 1909, they traveled together to Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where both received honorary degrees and lectured to American audiences hungry for the new psychology of the unconscious. The trip was a publicity watershed. Newspapers covered it, medical schools took note. Jung returned to Europe a minor celebrity and, more importantly, a man convinced that psychology could reshape modern culture. With Freud's support, Jung became the first president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, IPA, in 1910. He edited the yearbook, and worked to standardize methods, train clinicians, and defend psychoanalysis against fierce academic opposition. In these years, Jung was both organizer and theorist, clarifying technique while pursuing independent lines of research on myths, symbols, and religious experience. But differences were already fermenting. Where Freud framed libido as primarily sexual energy, Jung observed forms of psychic energy that animated curiosity, creativity, religious longing, and heroic striving. For Jung, the psyche was polymorphic, its eros one strand in a larger teleology of meaning. The break crystallized around Jung's 1912 work Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, Symbols of Transformation. There, Jung traced mythic motifs, the hero's journey, the mother, the rebirth image across literature, religion, and patients' dreams, arguing that such images are structural to the psyche, not mere disguises of sexual wishes. Libido, he insisted, is general life energy that the psyche symbolically transforms as it individuates. Freud read this as apostasy, a rift of method, clinical reduction versus symbolic amplification, of metaphysics, materialism versus an openness to transcendence, and of temperament, patriarch versus explorer, widened into open conflict. By 1913, the personal bond had snapped. In 1914, Jung resigned the IPA presidency. He lost friends, status, and the inner compass that the Freud Alliance had provided. What followed was both a crisis and a germination. In the winter of 1913, Jung began to experience an inundation of dreams and waking imaginations, floods, deserts of blood, a great old man, a wise child. Fearing psychosis, he chose instead to observe and participate methodically. He drew, wrote, dialogued with figures, and tracked symbolic sequences, what he would later formalize as active imagination. Portions of this material were later calligraphed and illuminated in the Red Book, a private manuscript unpublished until the 21st century. This disciplined descent convinced Jung that the unconscious is autonomous and creative, a generative matrix that produces mythopoetic images aiming at psychic balance and growth. Out of this period came the seeds of archetypes, the collective unconscious, anima, animus, persona, and shadow, and the lifelong project he called individuation. Jung's early career forged three lasting convictions. The psyche is lawful and symbolic, established empirically via association studies, meaning heals, even madness, carries intelligible mythic content. Science must widen to include subjective experience, culture, and spirituality if it is to do justice to the human being. These convictions would soon crystallize into a distinct school, analytical psychology. From complexes to archetypes, a new map of the inner world. Ego, the center of conscious identity, our I, coordinating perception, memory, and intention. Personal unconscious, forgotten memories, subliminal perceptions, and repressed material structured by complexes. Collective unconscious, deeper still, a species-wide inherited layer of the psyche that generates archetypal images and narrative patterns. For Jung, the collective unconscious is not a storehouse of specific ideas, but a pattern generator like neural architectures that predispose the organism to learn certain forms. Myths across cultures resemble one another not because of direct borrowing, but because human minds share deep structures of imaginal organization. Archetypes are organizing principles, tendencies to form images and motifs around core human situations: the mother, the father, the child, the hero, the wise old man, woman, the trickster, the shadow, the self. They are empty forms until clothed by culture and biography, yet they carry affective charge and teleology. They aim to move the psyche toward wholeness. The shadow. Everything the ego denies or devalues. Confronting it reduces projection and increases vitality. Anima, animus, the inner contrasexual figure. Engaging it refines relatedness and imagination. The self, the central archetype of order and totality, the pattern that seeks to integrate opposites across a lifetime. Archetypal images erupt in dreams, fantasies, symptoms, art, and religion. The analyst's task is not to force a single interpretation, but to amplify, to place the image in a wider mythic field so its living meaning can emerge. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes an inward, psychological individual, a whole distinguishing themselves from collective identifications and integrating split-off parts. It unfolds in phases, establishing the persona, the social mask that adapts us to roles, encountering the shadow, withdrawing projections, owning the denied, meeting anima, animus, transforming relationships and imagination, dialogue with the unconscious, dreams, symbols, active imagination, approximating the self, a more centered paradox-holding stance, outcome, not perfection, but wholeness, greater freedom, relatedness, creativity, and ethical responsibility. Jung observed stable attitudes and functions of consciousness. Attitudes: introversion, orientation to the inner world of ideas, and extroversion, orientation to the outer world of objects and people. Functions: thinking, logic, meaning, feeling, values, affect, sensation, facts, detail, intuition, patterns, possibility. Every personality privileges one attitude and one function, with an inferior function that remains underdeveloped yet holds creative potential. This typology, later adapted, imperfectly, by popular instruments, remains influential because it helps people name differences without pathologizing them, and it invites growth by engaging the inferior function rather than denying it. Dream analysis, not decoding into a single latent wish, but following the image, its context, amplification across myth and art, and its compensation to the conscious attitude. Active imagination, a disciplined dialogue with inner figures, writing, drawing, or movement, allowing symbolic sequences to unfold while the ego remains observant and ethically responsible. Both methods treat the unconscious as partner, not enemy and other, with which the ego must negotiate to evolve. Jung noticed striking, meaningful coincidences, inner events, dreams, images, that coincided with outer events in ways not plausibly causal, yet psychically apt. He proposed synchronicity as a causal connecting principle. When an archetypal situation is constellated, inner and outer may align by meaning. Whether one accepts the hypothesis or treats it as phenomenology, the concept honors a common clinical reality. Patients experience fateful alignments that help them reconceive their lives. Jung believed the crisis of modernity was not simply moral or economic, it was symbolic. Scientific triumph had narrowed our images of meaning. Religion's dogmas had lost credibility, but their symbolic power to hold opposites, ritualize transformation, and connect individuals to transpersonal values remained psychologically necessary. Analytical psychology offers a third path, not a return to literalism, not a rejection of spirit, but a psychology of symbols grounded in experience. It normalized the presence of inner multiplicity, complexes. It rehabilitated dreams, myths, and art as valid psychological data. It offered a lifelong developmental arc, individuation, beyond symptom relief. It furnished a non-pathologizing language for personality, diversity, types. It reopened dialogue between science and meaning, therapy and culture. These contributions explain why Jung is often hailed, sometimes imprecisely, as a father figure in Western psychology. He founded a full-spectrum framework that spans clinic, culture, and spirit. Travel as psychological fieldwork, Carl Jung was not content to study the psyche from the confines of a European consulting room. For him, the human mind was not only shaped by personal experience, but also infused with cultural patterns and collective heritage. If these patterns were truly universal, as his theory of the collective unconscious suggested, then they should be visible in distant societies untouched by European traditions. Between 1924 and 1938, Jung undertook a series of expeditions that served as psychological fieldwork to North Africa, to the American Southwest, to India, and elsewhere. These journeys were not mere tourist ventures. Jung approached each with the mindset of an anthropologist, a mythographer, and a depth psychologist rolled into one. North Africa and the Sahara, 1920 and 1925. In Tunisia and Algeria, Jung immersed himself in Islamic architecture, desert landscapes, and Berber traditions. The vastness of the Sahara, with its endless horizon and silence, struck him as an external metaphor for the collective unconscious, a boundless space in which images could emerge like oases. He paid particular attention to mandala-like designs in Islamic art, seeing them as living symbols of the self, the archetype of psychological wholeness. The absence of figural representation in Islamic religious art, replaced by geometric and calligraphic forms, intrigued Jung because it revealed a different way the psyche seeks order and centering without relying on human imagery. Taos Pueblo, New Mexico, 1925-1926, Jung's 1,925 trip to the American Southwest brought him to the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, where he met Ochue Biano, Mountain Lake, a Pueblo elder. Their conversations revealed stark cultural contrasts. In the European worldview, humans were at the mercy of a mechanistic universe. In Pueblo cosmology, Humans played an active role in maintaining cosmic harmony through rituals, song, and dance, literally helping the sun rise each day. Jung recognized this as an example of participation mystique, a term from Levi Brühl, a mode of consciousness where self and world are not rigidly separated. He concluded that modern Europeans had become dangerously alienated from this reciprocal relationship with nature. India, 1938. In 1938, Jung visited India, where he encountered Hindu philosophy, Buddhist thought, and yogic traditions firsthand. He met scholars of Vedanta and practitioners of meditation, gaining insight into concepts such as Atman and Brahman. While Jung admired Eastern spiritual systems, he cautioned Westerners against wholesale adoption without integration. For Jung, the task was not to become Eastern, but to reawaken the symbolic life within Western culture. He argued that the Western psyche, steeped in Judeo-Christian imagery and Enlightenment rationality, needed to work through its own symbolic material rather than bypass it for exotic imports. Across these journeys, Jung observed how archetypal images emerged in every culture, though clothed in different symbols. The hero, the great mother, the trickster, the wise old man, all were present, whether in African folk tales, Pueblo dances, or Hindu myths. His travels deepened his conviction that the collective unconscious is not a metaphor, but a real psychological foundation, an inherited structural layer that binds humanity together. Upon returning to Europe, Jung increasingly saw the industrialized West as suffering from symbolic starvation. In his lectures and writings, he warned that without a living symbolic life, the unconscious would erupt in destructive ways through mass movements, fanatical ideologies, and psychological disorientation. His cross-cultural insights thus became not just academic observations, but diagnoses for Western civilization, personal life, and marriage. Meeting Emma Rauschenbach. Carl Jung married Emma Rauschenbach in 1903, shortly after beginning his work at Berg-Helsley. Emma came from a wealthy Swiss family, which provided the financial stability for Jung to build both a private practice and a career that allowed for expansive research and travel. But Emma was not merely a supporter. She became a trained analyst in her own right, publishing respected work on the Grail legend. The Jung-Rauschenbach marriage was complex, reflecting both devotion and tension. On one hand, Emma served as a steady presence, managing household affairs and often mediating Jung's intense work rhythms. On the other, Jung's relationships with certain women in his professional circle, most notably Toni Wolff, a former patient who became his close collaborator, placed strain on the marriage. Rather than a traditional domestic arrangement, their relationship evolved into a psychological partnership. Emma herself saw value in Jung's intellectual and emotional exchanges with others, provided the marriage's core remained intact. Toni Wolff, the other collaborator. Toni Wolff was instrumental in helping Jung articulate some of his key concepts, especially regarding the feminine psyche and the anima. While her presence was controversial in social terms, Jung integrated her insights into his analytical work. This unusual triangle, Carl, Emma, and Toni, lasted for decades, sustained by a mutual respect for the psychological work at hand, though not without human pain. The Jungs settled in Küsnacht, on Lake Zurich, where they raised 5 children. The home doubled as Jung's consulting space, filled with books, symbolic art, and objects from his travels. Despite his frequent absences, Jung maintained an active role as a father, often telling his children symbolic stories, many drawn from mythology and dreams to convey psychological truths. Perhaps the most revealing artifact of Jung's personal life is Bollingen Tower, a stone retreat he built on the shores of Lake Zurich beginning in 1923. Expanded over decades, the tower became a living embodiment of individuation. Circular towers for wholeness, carvings of Latin and Greek inscriptions, mandalas, and astrological motifs, Jung claimed that building Bollingen was an expression in stone of my innermost thoughts and of the knowledge I had acquired. Those close to Jung described him as both deeply empathetic and fiercely independent. He could be warm, humorous, and patient with those who approached him in sincerity, yet aloof or abrupt when he sensed superficiality. His marriage reflected this paradox, a relationship rooted in constancy, yet allowing him the freedom to explore the depths of the psyche wherever they led. Carl Jung's personality defies simple labels. To colleagues, he was a towering intellect with the confidence of a scientist and the sensitivity of a poet. To patients, he was at once a compassionate guide and an uncompromising mirror. To himself, he was a man in dialogue with the infinite inner other, a relationship he valued above all titles or public roles. Jung could embody apparent contradictions without feeling a need to resolve them prematurely. Rational empiricist and mystic, social leader and solitary contemplative, loyal friend and fierce debater. It was this capacity to hold the tension of opposites, a phrase he often used, that shaped both his psychology and his personal interactions. Jung identified himself as an introvert in his own typology, oriented toward the inner world of ideas and images. Yet, paradoxically, he could be magnetic in social settings, especially when discussing subjects that engaged him. In public lectures, his presence commanded attention. In smaller gatherings, he preferred deep, one-on-one conversations to small talk. This oscillation between retreat and engagement mirrored the rhythm of his creative process. Extended periods of solitude for research, followed by bursts of public activity to share and refine ideas. Though often seen as a serious figure, Jung possessed a playful sense of humor. He enjoyed puns, light teasing, and unexpected analogies. This humor served as a psychological tool, helping to diffuse tension in therapy and to invite patients into a more flexible relationship with their own inner conflict. He was also pragmatic in the consulting room. While steeped in mythology and symbolism, he kept his interpretations grounded in the lived reality of the patient. A dream about a lion might be linked to ancient sun gods, but also to the patient's fear of an overbearing boss. Jung was unafraid to follow a line of inquiry wherever it led, even if it risked alienating allies. His break with Freud is the most famous example, but throughout his career he challenged prevailing orthodoxies in psychiatry, religion, and even physics. The concept of synchronicity, for instance, drew skepticism from scientists, yet Jung pursued it because it fit his clinical observations and personal experiences. For Jung, the unconscious was not an enemy to be conquered, nor merely a repository of repressed material. It was a living partner. He often engaged it deliberately through active imagination, dream recording, and artistic creation. This personal practice lent authenticity to his teaching. He was not prescribing methods he had not tested on himself. Jung's writings and recollections from peers reveal a man aware of his own shadow, the unacknowledged, less polished parts of the self. He acknowledged pride, stubbornness, and a tendency to withdraw when feeling misunderstood. Yet he also made deliberate efforts to own these traits, sometimes openly discussing his flaws in lectures to illustrate the universality of the shadow in human life. Jung worked in bursts of intense concentration. When immersed in a project, whether writing a book, carving at Bollingen, or decoding a dream, he could work from dawn until late into the night, seemingly without fatigue. His study and consulting room were cluttered with books, manuscripts, and artifacts, yet he had an internal order that allowed him to locate a reference or note within moments. Major works and influence. 1. Psychological Types, 1921. In Psychological Types, Jung introduced his now famous concepts of introversion and extroversion, along with the 4 functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. He framed these not as rigid categories, but as orientations that shape perception and judgment. This work provided a non-pathologizing language for personality differences and laid the groundwork for later tools like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. 2. Symbols of Transformation, 1912. This book marked Jung's decisive break with Freud. Here, libido is reframed as general psychic energy, not solely sexual. Jung used case studies, dreams, and mythological parallels to show how the psyche transforms energy into symbolic forms, especially during crises or major life transitions. 3. The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, 1934-1954. In this collected set of essays, Jung systematically explored the archetypes, universal motifs like the hero, mother, shadow, and self. He argued that these patterns emerge in dreams, art, and religion across cultures and eras, forming a shared psychological heritage. 4. Aeon, 1951. One of Jung's most profound and challenging works, Aeon examines the archetype of the self and its symbolic representations in the figure of Christ, astrological ages, and alchemical imagery. Here, Jung's integration of psychology, theology, and history reaches full maturity. 5. Memories, Dreams, Reflections, 1961. Part autobiography, part psychological meditation, Memories, Dreams, Reflections was completed near the end of Jung's life. It offers insight into his inner development, his confrontation with the unconscious, and his reflections on meaning, death, and the continuation of life beyond personal existence. Jung's influence extends far beyond clinical psychology. Literature and film. From Hermann Hesse's Demian to the Star Wars saga, Jungian archetypes shape narrative structure, religion, and spirituality. His work informs modern approaches to comparative religion and the study of myth. Art therapy. Techniques like active imagination have become staples in creative psychotherapy. Organizational development. Jungian typology influences leadership training and team building. The post-war period, 1945-1961. After the devastation of World War II, Carl Jung's ideas found a new audience. The horrors of mass destruction, totalitarianism, and genocide made his warnings about the shadow of the collective psyche suddenly urgent. Many intellectuals saw the war as an eruption of the unconscious on a global scale, exactly the kind of mass possession Jung had described decades earlier. In this period, Jung's public lectures and writings turned increasingly toward the psychological renewal of Western culture. He argued that true peace required not only political treaties, but also psychological integration individuals, confronting their own shadow and recognizing the archetypal forces at play in society. The Bollingen years. Jung's retreat at Bollingen Tower became his personal monastery. He expanded the complex over decades, adding towers, inscriptions, and symbolic carvings. In these later years, he spent much time in solitude, reading, carving stone, and reflecting. Friends and colleagues who visited often remarked that Bollingen seemed to exist outside of time, a physical manifestation of Jung's inner world. Here, Jung deepened his study of alchemy, which he saw as a symbolic map of the individuation process. To him, the alchemist's quest to transform base metals into gold mirrored the psyche's journey toward wholeness. In 1944, Jung suffered a heart attack that left him near death for several weeks. During this time, he experienced vivid visions of floating above the earth, seeing continents from space, and entering a cosmic temple. He later described these experiences in Memories, Dreams, Reflections as deeply transformative, giving him a sense that life on Earth was just one phase of a larger journey. Despite declining health in the 1952nd, Jung continued to write and revise his works. Notable late publications included Aeon, 1951, Mysterium Conjunctionis, 1955-1956, and Memories, Dreams, Reflections, 1961. Carl Jung died peacefully on the 6th of June, 1961, at his home in Küsnacht, Switzerland, at the age of 85. His death was marked by tributes from psychologists, philosophers, theologians, and artists around the world. The C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, founded in 1948, continued to train analysts in his methods, ensuring the preservation and growth of analytical psychology. In the decades following his death, Jung's work spread far beyond clinical settings. Popular psychology embraced his concepts of introversion and extroversion. Depth therapy schools integrated Jungian dream work and archetype theory. Creative arts used Jung's symbolism as a wellspring for storytelling and visual motifs. Religious and spiritual communities found in Jung a bridge between psychology and theology. Even in the neuroscientific era, Jung's model remains influential for its depth, narrative richness, and cross-cultural applicability. While many psychologists contributed important theories, Jung created an entire self-contained school analytical psychology with its own theoretical foundation, clinical techniques, and training institutions. This system addressed not only mental illness, but also the lifelong growth of healthy individuals. Jung moved beyond Freud's focus on repressed sexuality to propose a multi-layered psyche, the ego, center of consciousness, the personal unconscious, forgotten, repressed experiences, the collective unconscious, universal archetypal structures. This expansion allowed psychology to address myth, religion, and culture as integral to mental life. Jung refused to separate human psychology from the quest for meaning. He engaged with theology, Eastern philosophies, alchemy, and comparative mythology not to dilute psychology, but to enrich it with symbolic depth. In doing so, he gave modern psychology a language for spiritual experience without dogma. Terms like introvert, extrovert, archetype, shadow, and synchronicity have entered everyday language. These concepts remain clinically useful and culturally resonant decades later. Jung's influence reaches clinical practice, Jungian analysis, depth therapy, education, learning styles, personality development, business, leadership, and team building, arts, narrative archetypes, symbolic imagery, religion, psychological approaches to scripture and ritual. Jung did not simply theorize about the unconscious, he confronted it directly in his own life. His Red Book period stands as a model of courageous self-exploration, demonstrating that the psychologist's own individuation is inseparable from their capacity to guide others. Carl Jung is called the master of psychology because he mastered the art of seeing the psyche whole, not as a machine, nor as a mystery to be feared, but as a living, symbolic, self-organizing system. He is the father of Western analytical thought because he built a durable framework that continues to guide therapy, inspire creativity, and restore meaning in a world often starved for it. The man who mapped the soul. Carl Jung's journey began in the quiet Swiss village of Keswil and ended on the tranquil shores of Lake Zurich, but between those 2 points, he traversed some of the deepest and most complex territories a human being can explore, the landscapes of the psyche. He was not content to observe from a distance. Jung entered the depths himself, recording dreams, engaging inner figures, building stone towers to embody his visions. He did not theorize in abstraction. He lived his psychology. In this way, his work stands apart from purely academic models. It carries the unmistakable weight of experience tested in the crucible of a human life, a vision beyond symptom treatment. Many psychological models focus primarily on alleviating distress, managing disorders, or restoring basic functioning. Jung acknowledged these aims but reached further. To him, the ultimate goal of psychology was to guide individuals toward individuation, the full realization of the self. This process was not a luxury for the few. It was a necessity for anyone seeking a life of meaning, creativity, and ethical wholeness. In his framework, therapy was not a repair shop. It was a pilgrimage, one in which the therapist acted not as a mechanic, but as a guide, helping the traveler read the symbolic signs along the way. The courage to cross boundaries. Jung was willing to cross intellectual and cultural boundaries that many of his peers avoided. He engaged seriously with Eastern philosophy, Native American spirituality, medieval alchemy, and modern physics. This was not dilettantism. It was a deliberate effort to build a psychology that could speak to the whole human being, integrating body, mind, culture, and spirit. In doing so, Jung restored to Western psychology something it had begun to lose a sense of depth and sacredness in the human journey. The language of archetypes. Jung's archetypes, the hero, the shadow, the anima, animus, the self, gave both clinicians and laypeople a way to understand recurring patterns in dreams, relationships, and cultural narratives. These patterns were not imposed from outside. They arose from the deep structures of the psyche itself. By identifying and naming them, Jung gave the world a symbolic vocabulary that has proven enduring and adaptable. A master's method. Dialogue with the unconscious. What truly sets Jung apart is his approach to the unconscious as a dialogue partner. In his view, the unconscious was not just a repository of repressed impulses, nor a chaotic force to be subdued. It was a source of wisdom, creativity, and renewal. Through dream analysis, active imagination, and symbolic amplification, Jung developed practical methods for engaging with this inner dimension. These tools continue to be used by therapists, artists, and seekers worldwide. Ethical responsibility and the shadow. Jung's insistence on confronting the shadow individually and collectively feels more relevant than ever. He warned that when individuals refuse to face their own dark sides, they project them onto others, fueling prejudice, conflict, and even large-scale violence. In this way, his psychology was not only about personal growth, but also about social responsibility. Why he is called the Master of Psychology. Carl Jung earns this title for several intertwined reasons. Depth and breadth. He built a psychology that could address neurosis, creativity, religion, myth, and the arc of a lifetime. System builder. Analytical psychology is a coherent, teachable system still in practice more than 60 years after his death. Cultural reach. His concepts have permeated art, literature, film, education, and leadership studies. Lived authenticity. He modeled the courage to explore one's own unconscious and share the results publicly. Why he is called the father of Western analytical thought. In the landscape of Western psychology, Jung stands as the founder of a distinct branch, analytical psychology, which complements and challenges other major schools like psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and humanistic psychology. His synthesis of clinical observation, symbolic analysis, and cross-cultural research created a foundation for an approach that treats the human being as more than a sum of symptoms. Jung's work remains alive, not because it is frozen in dogma, but because it invites ongoing exploration. Analytical psychology encourages each generation to re-engage with the unconscious, to listen for the images and patterns emerging in dreams, culture, and personal crises. In this sense, Jung did not give us a finished map, he gave us a compass. Carl Gustav Jung's life and work stand as a rare example of a human being who ventured boldly into the uncharted territories of the mind and returned with a map that was not rigid or prescriptive, but alive, symbolic, and expansive. Born in a small Swiss village in 1875, he lived through an era of immense social, scientific, and cultural upheaval. Yet throughout his 85 years, he remained committed to one central mission: to understand the psyche in its fullest dimensions and to help others embark on their own journey towards psychological wholeness. From his early days at the Berghoseley Psychiatric Hospital, Jung's curiosity led him beyond the boundaries of conventional psychiatry. The word association experiments revealed to him that the unconscious mind was not merely a chaotic repository of forgotten material, but a structured, dynamic realm populated by complexes that exerted real influence over thought, feeling, and behavior. His encounter and eventual break with Sigmund Freud marked the first of several pivotal turning points, freeing him to construct a psychology that embraced not only the biological and personal, but also the cultural, historical, and spiritual dimensions of human life. The creation of analytical psychology was Jung's defining intellectual achievement. Here, he articulated the layered model of the psyche, the ego, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious, and described the archetypes that structure human experience across cultures and epochs. These archetypes, such as the hero, the mother, the shadow, and the self, are not merely abstract concepts. They are living patterns that emerge in dreams, myths, and works of art, guiding and challenging us in equal measure. Through this lens, Jung provided a framework that could encompass both the clinical needs of therapy and the universal search for meaning. Perhaps Jung's most enduring contribution is the process he called individuation, the lifelong task of integrating the disparate parts of the self into a more harmonious whole. In a world that often pressures individuals to conform, Jung's vision of individuation offers a counterpoint. The call to become truly oneself, to reconcile inner opposites, and to live in conscious relationship with the deeper currents of the psyche. For Jung, this was not an abstract ideal, but a vital necessity, both for personal fulfillment and for the health of society as a whole. Jung's personality itself was a study in paradox. He was an introvert who could command a lecture hall, a scientist who explored mystical traditions, a family man whose marriage with Emma Rauschenbach endured despite unconventional complexities. His home in Küsnacht and his retreat at Bollingen Tower became extensions of his inner world spaces where thought, symbol, and stone were woven into lasting forms. Visitors noted his warmth, humor, and capacity for deep listening, alongside a fierce independence that refused to bow to intellectual fashion. His travels to North Africa, the American Southwest, and India deepened his conviction that the human psyche is both universal and culturally specific. In Pueblo rituals, Islamic art, and Hindu philosophy, he saw the same archetypal patterns expressed through different symbolic clothing. These encounters reinforced his belief that psychology must honor diversity of expression while recognizing the shared structures that unite humanity. In the final decades of his life, Jung's influence expanded far beyond the consulting room. Artists, writers, theologians, and educators found in his work a language for the patterns they had intuited but could not name. Terms like introvert and extrovert entered common speech. The hero's journey and the shadow became staples of storytelling. The mandala appeared in art therapy rooms and meditation practices. Jung's ideas even reached into organizational leadership, education, and political analysis, demonstrating the adaptability and enduring relevance of his insights. Why, then, is Carl Jung called the master of psychology? It is because he mastered the art of seeing the psyche whole, honoring its complexity without reducing it to a single formula, integrating its rational and irrational aspects, and providing tools for engaging with its depths. He did not shy away from the darker aspects of human nature. Instead, he urged individuals and societies alike to face their shadows, warning that unacknowledged darkness would inevitably manifest in destructive ways. Why is he called the father of Western analytical thought? Because he founded a discipline that remains vibrant today, with training institutes, practicing analysts, and a growing body of research and application. He gave psychology a mythopoetic dimension, bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern science, between the measurable and the immeasurable. Jung's legacy is not a static monument, but a living tradition. His work invites us not to worship his conclusions, but to undertake our own exploration of the unconscious, to engage with dreams and symbols, to listen for the voice of the self, and to navigate the ongoing process of individuation. In this way, Jung remains less a distant historical figure than a companion on the journey, a guide who reminds us that the path to wholeness is both deeply personal and universally human. As he carved above the door of his Bollingen retreat, Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Called or not called, God will be present. In that inscription lies the heart of his psychology, that beyond our conscious plans and struggles, there is a deeper presence, an ordering principle, a source of meaning waiting to be recognized and integrated into our lives. Carl Gustav Jung's life was a testament to the transformative power of looking inward with courage, curiosity, and respect for the unknown. More than 6 decades after his passing, his voice continues to echo in therapy rooms, in novels and films, in the classrooms of philosophy and art, and in the quiet moments when an individual pauses to consider a dream, a symbol, or a sudden coincidence. It is in these moments, when the conscious and unconscious meet, that Jung's spirit is most alive. And perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion, that Carl Jung's greatest gift is not simply his theories, his books, or his public influence, but the spark he ignites in each of us, the invitation to engage with the mystery of our own psyche, to walk the path toward wholeness, and to contribute in our own way to the unfolding story of the human soul.